On a freezing morning in early 1946, something deeply unsettling unfolded inside a U.S. Army prison camp in the heart of Kansas. Camp Concordia was usually loud at mealtime, chairs scraping, guards calling orders, prisoners talking in low voices. That morning, it felt like a graveyard. Hundreds of German prisoners sat in absolute stillness. Meals were served. No one touched them. Hot rations cooled slowly as the smell of food lingered in the air, ignored. Outside the barracks, the winter wind swept across endless farmland. Inside, American guards exchanged nervous looks. None of them understood what was happening. These men were not demanding better treatment. They were not protesting abuse. They were not trying to escape. They were refusing freedom. After a long silence, one prisoner rose to his feet. Hans Schmidt, once a soldier in North Africa, now a respected figure inside the camp, spoke in calm, precise English, a language he had mastered while working American farms for nearly 3 years. "We will not eat," he said, "not until we are assured we will not be sent back to Germany." The camp commander, Colonel Francis Howard, stood frozen near the entrance. Minutes earlier, he had received direct orders from Washington. All German prisoners were to be returned to Europe immediately. The war was over. Their captivity was ending. What he had not expected was resistance, not violence, not anger, but fear. Men willing to starve rather than go home. The U.S. Army had prepared for riots, escapes, even sabotage. It had never prepared for prisoners who begged to remain behind barbed wire. This moment marked the beginning of a forgotten rebellion, one erased from textbooks and buried in classified reports. A protest not against imprisonment, but against release. And at its center lies a disturbing question. What kind of captivity makes men prefer prison to freedom?
In Texas, the situation grew even more tragic. Josef Kramer, a German prisoner assigned to work on a dairy farm, had fallen in love with Anna Schneider, a German-American woman whose family employed him. Over 18 months of daily contact, affection deepened into commitment. Marriage, Kramer believed, might offer a legal path to remain. Anna applied for permission to marry him. The Army denied the request. Even if they wed, immigration authorities explained, Kramer would still be deported. Anna would have to choose between her country and her husband. On March 15, 1946, overwhelmed by despair, Kramer attempted suicide. He survived, but the incident sent shockwaves through the entire POW system. Military intelligence began monitoring camps closely, fearing similar attempts might follow. A quiet, symbolic defiance. At Camp Clinton, Mississippi, prisoners abandoned a long-standing tradition. For years, evenings had been filled with German songs. Now the music changed. Instead, prisoners sang American songs they had learned while working outside the camps. Home on the Range, You Are My Sunshine, even the Star-Spangled Banner. It was not mockery, it was mourning, a wordless declaration of who they believed they had become. American guards struggled emotionally with their orders. Private First Class James Morrison, stationed at Camp Trinidad, wrote home in late March. "We're sending away men we've eaten with, worked with, played ball with. Some cry openly. Others look hollow. I fought Germans overseas, but these don't feel like enemies anymore." The human stories behind the protest. Behind every petition, every hunger strike, and every silent act of resistance was a deeply personal story, one that could not be reduced to numbers or policy. These were not abstract prisoners on a transport list. They were men who had lost everything and then found something unexpected behind American barbed wire. One of them was Vera Lentz.
Captured near Salerno, Italy, in September 1943, Lentz spent nearly 3 years at Camp Swift, Texas, working as a carpenter. He repaired barns, built fences, and helped maintain farmhouses across the region. Over time, he became known not as a prisoner, but as a skilled worker and a dependable presence. In early 1945, a letter arrived that shattered what remained of his old life. His hometown, Dresden, had been destroyed in the firebombing. His parents were dead. His sister was gone. His fiancée had not survived. There was nothing left to return to. Lentz wrote to the camp chaplain, Father William O'Connor, in a letter preserved in church archives in Austin. The tone was not angry, it was broken. "I survived the war, only to be sent back to a graveyard," he wrote. "Here I have work, I have friends, I am treated like a human being. Why must I leave life to return to death?" Father O'Connor tried to intervene. He contacted military officials, describing Lentz as stable, hard-working, and deeply traumatized by his losses. The response was polite and firm. No exceptions. The teacher who believed in a different Germany. Another case unfolded at Camp Mexia, Texas. Helmut Friedrich, a former schoolteacher from Hamburg, Germany, had been captured in France in 1944. Inside the camp, he became an informal educator. He taught English to fellow prisoners and offered German lessons to American guards, curious about the language and culture of the men they watched. One of those guards was Lieutenant Thomas Bradley, the camp's education officer. The two bonded over books, poetry, and discussions about democracy and responsibility. Friedrich openly rejected Nazi ideology and spoke at length about rebuilding Germany on different principles. When repatriation orders arrived, Bradley took an extraordinary step. He wrote a formal letter of recommendation. "This man represents the Germany we should want to see rebuilt," he argued. "He believes in democratic values, has fully rejected Nazism, and would contribute positively to American society." The letter was filed. Nothing came of it. Friedrich was placed on a transport ship in May 1946 and sent back to a country that no longer resembled the one he had taught in. When grief met understanding. At Camp Clark, Missouri, another story revealed how deeply boundaries had blurred. A prisoner named Carl Becker had been assigned to work on the farm of the Wilson family. Their son had been killed during the Normandy invasion. When Becker first arrived, the family was openly hostile. He represented the uniform responsible for their loss. Over time, something shifted. Working side by side, grief gave way to conversation. Not forgiveness, something more complicated, recognition. When Becker's deportation date was announced, Mr. Wilson drove directly to the camp and asked to speak with the commander. According to a report later filed by camp officials, Wilson said, "My boy died fighting Germans, but this man didn't kill him. I know the difference now. Carl wants to stay. We want him to stay. Why can't that matter?" The commander had no answer that could change the outcome. The machinery of departure. Despite protests, petitions, and interventions, the repatriation process moved forward with bureaucratic precision. Prisoners were assigned departure dates. Names were called. Lists were finalized. They were loaded onto trains under guard, transported to coastal ports, and placed aboard Liberty ships bound for Europe. Most were first sent to France or Britain, then transferred to camps in occupied Germany for processing and eventual release. At Camp Concordia, the hunger strike ended only after authorities threatened forced feeding and solitary confinement. Faced with spending their final days in America isolated, most resumed eating, not in surrender, but in exhaustion. Between April and July 1946, the American POW system emptied. A farewell no one expected. At Camp Hearn, Texas, something unprecedented occurred. Local townspeople gathered outside the fences as the final transports prepared to leave. Some brought food for the journey. Others carried small gifts, photographs, or handwritten addresses. Prisoners stood in formation one last time. They collected their few possessions and boarded waiting trucks. Many cried openly. On May 23, 1946, the final group left Camp Concordia. Among them was Hans Schmidt, the man who had announced the hunger strike months earlier. As the truck pulled away, Schmidt looked back across the Kansas prairie. America had been his home longer than anywhere else since the war began. An American guard who witnessed the departure later said, "They looked like men being sent to execution, not men going home." What came after? The fate of the repatriated prisoners varied dramatically. Those released into the American, British, or French zones faced extreme hardship, but generally survived. Cities lay in ruins. Housing was scarce. Food shortages persisted until international aid programs began delivering relief years later. For prisoners sent to the Soviet zone, the outcome was often catastrophic. Many were rearrested immediately. Others disappeared into forced labor systems. Some never returned. A small number eventually found their way back to the United States. Vera Lentz, the carpenter from Dresden, immigrated in 1952 under the Displaced Persons Act. He settled in Texas, not far from Camp Swift, and worked quietly as a carpenter until his death in 1989. Helmut Friedrich arrived in 1954, eventually teaching German at a Missouri high school. In 1976, he published a memoir titled Prisoner of Peace, reflecting on the strange contradiction of finding freedom in captivity. Carl Becker returned in 1953, sponsored by the Wilson family. He worked their farm for 2 decades, never married, and was buried in the family plot when he died. But most never came back. They rebuilt lives in Germany, carrying memories of America like something unreal, rarely spoken aloud. The ones who never returned. For the few former prisoners who eventually made it back to the United States, their stories became footnotes in immigration records and family memories. But for the vast majority, America remained something they carried only in recollection, a place they once belonged to, briefly, and then lost. One such story was that of Josef Kramer, the prisoner who had attempted suicide rather than be separated from Anna Schneider. Kramer survived his injuries and was deported later in 1946. Anna waited for him, holding on to letters that crossed the Atlantic slowly and inconsistently. For 3 years, their lives existed in suspension. In 1949, Anna made a choice few Americans could understand. She traveled to Germany. She found Kramer in Munich. They married soon after.